My mother-in-law told me something surprising. She said, "We're going to live together now. We turned the house into 2 separate homes to make it easier. Is the house in your name, Emma? Sorry to ask, but can you pay the $80,000 bill for the changes?" My mother-in-law and husband thought it was funny, but I felt determined. I was going to tell them something important, even though my husband didn't know yet. I had proof too. My name is Emma Davis, and I'm 26 years old. I live a little away from the city in a place surrounded by nature. I work in an office and draw pictures for fun. Recently, I've been sharing my drawings online and reading the comments people leave. My husband, who is 3 years older than me, and I have been happily married and living in our beloved old farmhouse since we got married. But there's been a visitor who comes by once a month since then, and they always give me a headache. "Emma, I'm here. Please open up quickly." I hurried to the front door when I heard the insistent banging. "Ah, it's my mother-in-law. I'll open it right away," I said, even though there's a doorbell right next to the door. I tried to smile as I opened the sliding door. There are so many bugs around here. It's so annoying. Is George still at work? Poor thing, even on Saturday. Oh, I brought some of his favorite food. I saw a tired-looking woman holding a big bag waiting at the door. As she chattered on, I tried to keep up my fake smile. This visitor, who comes once a month, is none other than my husband's mother, my mother-in-law. Since my husband is an only child, she feels it's her duty to look after him even after we got married. She even gives me tips on how to manage the house. Last time she visited, she rearranged the whole fridge, making it a hassle for me to prepare breakfast the next day. I remember my husband telling me before we got married, if my parents ever need care, we'll live together. I hope you understand. I'm disappointed at the thought of leaving our lovely old house when the time comes, but I've accepted it. What bothers me more is the idea of living with my mother-in-law all the time. I feel sorry for my husband, as it's not something I'm looking forward to. Fast forward 2 years into our married life in the farmhouse. My husband told me that his father slipped on the stairs at home and broke his leg. They'll need our help from now on. Let's live together, just like we talked about before we got married. Yes, I'm worried too. So I think it's a good idea. Can I still do my drawings? I was concerned about my father-in-law's health, so I agreed to move in with them without hesitation. But I was worried that taking care of my in-laws and doing housework might leave me with no time for my drawing hobby. Whether he knew about my worries or not, my husband just said, "I want you to focus on the house," and left for his office. Left alone in my room, I felt like I was giving up on my husband. As I looked through my drawings, I started sorting out my feelings. Just when I had decided to live with them, something unexpected happened. While I was at work, I suddenly felt numbness in my hands and feet and got really dizzy. I collapsed. Thankfully, a colleague called an ambulance, and although I wasn't in danger, it turned out I had had a stroke at a young age after a medical checkup. Even though I had been warned about high blood pressure during health checkups before, I regretted not taking it seriously and going to the hospital. From the time I found out about the illness to being hospitalized, including tests, surgery, and recovery, it took about 2 months. It all happened so quickly, and I realized my husband showed very little concern for me. After being diagnosed with a stroke at a young age, I called my husband with trembling hands. But all I heard was disappointment in his voice, saying, "So living together will have to wait, huh?" I couldn't believe he was more worried about living arrangements than my health. Luckily, my father-in-law was still in the hospital with a fracture, so I didn't have to worry about taking care of him. This allowed me to focus on my treatment, which was a silver lining. Plus, since we didn't have kids, that wasn't an added concern. Suddenly, I thought of my mother-in-law, always talking about wanting to see her grandchild soon. But I pushed that thought away and grabbed my sketchbook. Lately, I had been too busy with preparations to live with my in-laws and undergoing tests since my stroke to indulge in my favorite pastime of drawing. I knew once I moved in with them, I'd have even less time for it. I decided to view my time in the hospital as a gift of freedom from God and resolved to enjoy my hobby to the fullest. Once this period was over, I promised myself to give my best to my husband and in-laws, whether it was doing chores or anything else. The 2-month hospital stay flew by, and finally it was time to leave. My husband casually asked if he should pick me up, but I wanted some time alone, so I declined, feeling a bit guilty. As I rode the bus, I looked out the window and saw the familiar scenery. I realized I was already near home. The sunlight shining on the lush green leaves was breathtaking, and I felt a mix of emotions, thinking goodbye to this beautiful natural setting. Since my in-laws' house is closer to the city, my life is going to change a lot from now on. Feeling a bit sad, I stepped off the bus at the familiar stop. As I walked towards what was supposed to be my beloved old home, I suddenly froze in astonishment. Instead of the familiar private house I knew so well, there stood a completely unfamiliar house that I had never seen before. After being in a hospital for about 2 months, I double-checked the surrounding buildings and the path I took, wondering if I had somehow gotten a location wrong. But it was no mistake. There was no point in wandering around, so I timidly pressed the intercom of the unfamiliar house. A voice I knew well, undoubtedly my husband's, responded with a simple yes. Still feeling confused, I quietly said, "It's Michelle," into the intercom. The front door creaked open and my husband, dressed casually, appeared. "Ah, welcome home. You're back earlier than I expected. I had the day off today. I could have picked you up," George said. "George, what happened to our house? Why has it changed so much?" I interrupted him, feeling disbelief, noticing his relaxed demeanor, perhaps indicating he had just woken up with his messy hair. Ignoring my anxiousness, George only responded vaguely, "Huh? What's going on? What happened?" without addressing my question. Just then, laughter echoed from inside the house. Unable to believe it, I pushed past my husband and made my way to the living room. Opening the unfamiliar door leading to the living room, I saw my mother-in-law lying on a couch, watching TV. She was laughing heartily, holding her stomach. "Why is my mother-in-law in this house?" I asked, bewildered. "Michelle, welcome back. Hospital stays can be long, but don't worry. I took care of the house while you were gone," my mother-in-law said casually. I was puzzled by what my mother-in-law meant by taking care of the house. Did she mean chores? With a sinking feeling, I pressed her on why our old house had changed so much. Without any hint of remorse, she replied, "Well, since we're all going to live together, I thought it would be more comfortable to remodel it into a duplex." The words "remodeled it into a duplex" kept echoing in my head. My mother-in-law had always been one to meddle in our lives, but I never imagined she would renovate our house without asking. And weren't we supposed to move into my in-laws' house, closer to the city center? Every time she visited our old house, she complained about the bugs and the walk from the station. So why all the changes now? "Oh, and if something else important I have to tell you," my mother-in-law said, switching off the TV with a grin. "The remodeling cost a bit. I believe the title to this house is under your name, Michelle. I'm sorry, but could you handle the payment?" My mother-in-law chuckled, devoid of any hint of apology. "Ah, it's $80,000, she said, her smile growing wider. "That's the cost of remodeling, and the title to this house comes with it, Michelle. $80,000. Her unexpected words hit me like a punch to the head, and my legs started shaking. I couldn't even find the words to respond. As I stared at my mother-in-law, stunned and laughing without a care, my husband appeared at the entrance and slipped into the living room. Seeing him, I instinctively moved towards him, holding on to a faint hope that he would support me. I repeated to my husband exactly what my mother-in-law had said, desperately awaiting his reaction, but all I got from him was a cold reply. "Well, that sounds about right. You'll handle it, won't you?" That's just who he is. When I had a stroke, he cared more about our living arrangements than my health. He's the kind of man who listens to his mother's every word, no matter how absurd. A man who always believes his mother is right. My discomfort and dissatisfaction towards my husband reached a boiling point. Once it overflowed, I was done. With all my heart, I decided I would leave this family behind. "I understand now, George. I'm going to divorce you and your mother, Cecilia. And no, Cecilia, you can handle the renovation costs on your own." I declared this all at once and turned my back on them, intending to leave the room quickly, but they weren't going to let me go so easily. "I've been losing interest in you anyway, so it's no big deal. But remember, this house is in your name, Emma, so you have a responsibility to pay," George remarked. "That's right, feel free to leave, but please settle your dues first," added Cecilia. I was astonished by their selfishness. I couldn't help but sigh. I was sure if I turned around, I'd see their smug faces grinning in victory, but I refused to look back. I stood tall and replied, "You keep saying the house is in my name, George, but did you forget that ownership has been transferred to you?" I revealed the truth, but they only laughed. thinking I was lying to avoid paying. That's when I brought up how George had asked me to change the property's ownership when we got married, as he didn't want the house to be in his wife's name for appearance's sake. Since I didn't particularly care about the property title, I had immediately transferred it to his name. Upon hearing this, their laughter abruptly stopped, and I could feel their panic gradually setting in. I don't recall saying such a thing. There's no proof anyway, George retorted. Anticipating this response, I turned back to face them, walked past them, and opened a drawer in a shelf from our old house. Let's see, it should be somewhere around. Ah, here it is. This is the proof, I said, taking out a document that listed the property and house ownership and showed it to them. When I pointed to the part that showed the ownership was in George's name, his face went pale. That's fraud. I never thought you'd actually do it, and I definitely can't pay such a huge sum of $80,000. George exclaimed. I was disgusted by my husband's reaction. He started yelling as soon as he realized the payment obligation was on him. Since a decent conversation seems impossible, let's communicate through lawyers from now on. Cecilia, your son seems to be in quite a pickle, so please take good care of him from now on, I stated calmly beside my loud husband. I smiled at my mother-in-law, who stood dazed, and finally turned my back on them, leaving their home for good. After that, my husband called several times, but I chose to ignore him entirely, opting instead to communicate formally through a lawyer, given our strained relationship and the issues with my mother-in-law. The divorce was settled without any problems. Regarding my husband's accusation that changing the property's ownership was fraud, it was determined that it was a mutual decision made when we got married 2 years ago. My lawyer reassured me with a smile that this was neither fraud nor anything illegal. With that, all the uncertainty inside me disappeared completely. It turned out that I was supposed to foot the bill for renovating the house as soon as I got discharged from a hospital. I couldn't help but appreciate the well-executed, spiteful move of pushing me into a difficult situation just after I had undergone surgery and rehabilitation and finally got discharged due to illness. In the end, since the house was in my husband's name, it was his responsibility to pay the hefty renovation costs, and he ended up cornering himself. Moreover, I was able to secure alimony after the divorce was finalized. My husband, faced with a claim for an amount he couldn't possibly pay off, either borrowed money from risky sources or didn't pay at all. While I was in the midst of the legal battle with my husband and mother-in-law, I received an apology from my father-in-law, Bob, who had been hospitalized with a broken leg, saying, "I'm sorry for my wife and son's behavior." Of course, it didn't seem that Bob was directly involved in this matter, but it couldn't be denied that for 2 years after our marriage, he had turned a blind eye to his wife and my indifferent husband. After briefly replying to Bob's message, I made the decision to cut all ties with my old family and start afresh. Since then, my health has been gradually improving and I was able to return to work. When I was married, I used to draw illustrations, but I always felt restricted by my husband's presence. Now, I can immerse myself in drawing whenever and however I want. Initially, drawing was just a hobby, but now I receive job offers through the social networking site where I post my illustrations. I spend more time drawing for work than for pleasure these days. My current dream is to buy an old farmhouse in a somewhat rural town using the alimony from my husband and my savings, and to open an art studio there. Today, I'm taking the first step towards realizing that dream by heading to see an old farmhouse. As I gaze out at the scenery from the bus, I can't help but think back to the day I left the hospital, the day that changed my life forever. The natural scenery outside remains the same as it was that day, but my feelings are clearer now, and I'm filled with excitement for the new life that awaits me. The leaves on the trees, illuminated by the sunlight, look so bright and dazzling.